There comes a time in every person's life when they feel forgotten by the world, left behind by those they loved most. For Nahlee Yazzie, that moment came at 67, when she stood alone in the desert, holding the rusty key to her dead uncle's Adobe house, the only thing anyone had left her in years. Her children had moved to the cities, her husband was 6 feet under, and the modern world seemed to have no place for an old Apache woman who still believed in the old ways. The crumbling house seemed like just another burden, another reminder of all she'd lost. But sometimes the earth holds secrets that can change everything. When a scruffy yellow dog showed up at her door that first night, she thought it was just another stray looking for scraps. She never imagined this lonely companion would lead her to $3 million in buried treasure, old bonds and gold hidden beneath the floorboards for decades. But with that fortune comes danger from the same powerful men who once stole her people's land. What happens when a woman who thought she had nothing left discovers she has everything to fight for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from the Mescalero Apache Reservation to Uncle Ramon's place took Nahlee through country that remembered when her people owned every mesa and canyon as far as the eye could see. Now the land was carved up by fences and roads, dotted with trailer homes and gas stations that sold dream catchers made in China. She gripped the steering wheel of her old Ford pickup tighter as she passed the billboard, advertising authentic Indian casino experience. Complete with a cartoon chief in a feathered headdress, her uncle's Adobe house sat 30 miles off the main highway, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through juniper and sage. The GPS on her phone had given up 20 minutes ago, but Nahlee remembered the way from childhood visits when Uncle Ramon would tell stories by lamplight about the old days, when the Apache moved freely across this vast country like shadows on the wind. The key felt cold and foreign in her palm. Such a small thing to represent the end of a life. Uncle Ramon had been 91 when his heart finally gave out last month, alone in the Santa Fe hospital where they'd taken him after Maria Santos found him collapsed in his garden. The lawyer had called it a modest estate, just the house and 40 acres of scrubland that nobody else wanted. Her children, Sarah and Miguel, had been kind but practical when she told them about the inheritance. "Mom, you don't need to burden yourself with that old place," Sarah had said from her bright kitchen in Phoenix, her voice carrying the gentle authority of a daughter who'd become successful in the white world. At 42, Sarah managed a regional bank and lived in a subdivision where the streets had names like Desert Vista and Coyote Ridge, but had never seen a real coyote. "Just sell it and put the money toward that apartment we talked about, the one near the senior center." Miguel had been even more direct during their video call. From his Denver law office, surrounded by diplomas and awards, he'd pulled up property records on his computer screen. "The land's not worth much, Mom. Maybe 30,000 on a good day. You could use that money to travel, see the grandkids more often." They meant well, her children. They'd worked hard to build lives away from the reservation, away from the poverty and the small-mindedness that could trap a person in cycles of despair. But they'd also moved away from the stories, the ceremonies, the understanding that some things couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Thomas would have understood. Her husband had been gone 8 years now, taken by the diabetes that seemed to claim so many of their generation, but she could still feel his presence sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn. He'd been the one who taught their children to be proud of their Apache heritage while also preparing them to succeed in the modern world. The balance hadn't been easy, but Thomas had managed it with grace and humor until the end. Now, as Nahlee turned onto the final stretch of dirt road, she wondered if she was making a mistake. At 67, she should probably be thinking about simplifying her life, not taking on the responsibility of a remote property that would need repairs she couldn't afford. Her small house on the reservation was paid for, her needs were simple, and her monthly tribal benefits combined with Thomas's railroad pension gave her enough to live with dignity. But something had pulled her here anyway. Maybe it was curiosity about why Uncle Ramon had lived alone in the desert for so many years, turning away visitors and keeping to himself. Maybe it was the memory of his stories, the way his eyes would light up when he talked about the time before the white man's roads carved up the sacred places. Or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that Thomas used to tease her about, the part of her that refused to let go of things that mattered. The house came into view as she crested a small rise, and Nahlee's heart sank. The adobe walls were cracked and weathered, with gaps where the plaster had fallen away to reveal the mud brick underneath. The wooden vigas that supported the roof sagged in places, and several of the windows were boarded up. A rusty satellite dish clung to one corner of the structure like a metal spider, and weeds had grown up through the gravel driveway. She parked near the front door and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence out here was profound. No traffic, no neighbors' televisions, no sounds of modern life. Just whine through the sage and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was the kind of silence that could either heal a person or drive them mad, depending on what they brought to it. The front door stuck, swollen from the recent rains, and Nahlee had to put her shoulder against it to get it open. The smell hit her first. Musty air, old wood, and something else. Something that reminded her of her grandmother's house long ago. Sage, maybe, or sweetgrass. The main room was larger than it had looked from outside, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and built-in shelves lined with books and old pottery. Uncle Ramon's furniture was simple but well made. A wooden table and chairs, a leather sofa worn soft with age, a rocking chair by the window that looked out toward the mountains. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, but the house felt solid, patient, as if it had been waiting for someone to return. She found his walking stick leaning against the mantelpiece, the one he'd carried for as long as she could remember. The wood was dark with age and handling, carved with traditional Apache symbols that told the story of the 4 sacred directions and the animals that guided their people. Her fingers traced the familiar patterns, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice explaining the meanings. His English mixed with the old language that fewer people spoke each year. The bedrooms were small but comfortable, with thick adobe walls that would keep the space cool in summer and warm in winter. Uncle Ramon had lived simply, a narrow bed, a dresser, shelves lined with more books than she'd expected. History books mostly and novels about the Old West, but also technical manuals about railroads and surveying that surprised her. She'd known he'd worked for the railroad in his younger days, but she'd never thought much about what that work had involved. The kitchen was functional, but outdated, with an old propane stove and a refrigerator that hummed loudly when she plugged it in. The pipes groaned when she turned on the faucets, but clear water flowed after a few seconds of rusty spurting. The place was livable, which was more than she'd dared hope. As evening approached, she sat on the front porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching the sun set behind the distant peaks. The sky turned the color of turquoise and coral, the way it only did in high desert country, and stars began to appear in the deepening blue. This was the time of day when Uncle Ramon would tell his stories, when the boundary between the world of facts and the world of spirit seemed thinnest. That's when she saw the dog. It appeared at the edge of the circle of porch light, like a ghost materializing from the darkness, a medium-sized animal with yellow fur and intelligent dark eyes. Not a coyote, despite the pointed ears and lean build, but not quite like any domestic dog she'd ever seen either. It stood perfectly still, watching her with an alertness that seemed almost human. "Well, hello there," she said softly, setting down her coffee cup. "You live around here?" The dog's ears perked forward, but it didn't approach. Instead, it studied her with those dark eyes, as if trying to decide whether she belonged here or represented some kind of threat. After a long moment, it turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Nahlee wondering if she'd imagined the entire encounter. Inside, She made up Uncle Ramon's bed with sheets she'd brought from home and settled in for her first night in the Adobe house. The silence was even more complete than it had been during the day. No city sounds, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through the eaves and the settling sounds of old wood adjusting to the desert's temperature changes. She thought about her children, probably wondering how she was managing out here alone. She thought about Thomas, and how he would have loved this place, with its connection to the old ways and its view of country that hadn't changed much since their ancestors walked these paths. Most of all, she thought about Uncle Ramon, living out here by himself for so many years, tending his small garden and reading his books and keeping whatever secrets he'd carried to the grave. Somewhere in the darkness outside, she heard a sound that might have been an animal moving through the brush, or might have been something else entirely. The house creaked around her like an old ship settling into harbor, and Nahlee drifted off to sleep, wondering what tomorrow would bring in this place that felt both strange and familiar. Like a half-remembered dream from childhood, the yellow dog was back the next morning, sitting patiently by the front door, as if it had been waiting for her to wake up. This time, when she opened the door, it didn't run away. Instead, it looked up at her with those intelligent eyes and wagged its tail once. A tentative greeting that seemed to ask permission to stay. "I suppose you're hungry," she said. And the dog's ears perked forward as if it understood every word. The dog, she'd started thinking of him as Yellow, though she suspected he had a real name somewhere in his past, had been with her for 3 days now. He was well-trained, housebroken, and seemed to know the property better than she did. When she worked in Uncle Ramon's small garden, pulling weeds and assessing what could be salvaged, Yellow would patrol the perimeter like a sentry. When she cooked simple meals on the old propane stove, he would lie by the kitchen door, always positioned where he could watch both her and the approach to the house. But it was his behavior near the stone fireplace that puzzled her most. Every morning, without fail, Yellow would go to the hearth and sniff along the base of the stones, his nose working systematically from one end to the other. At first, Nahlee assumed he was following the scent of mice or pack rats. Old houses in the desert always had their share of small visitors. But as she watched more carefully, she realized his attention was focused on one specific area, a section of the floor where the wooden planks met the stone foundation. On the 4th morning, she found him there again, but this time he wasn't just sniffing. His claws scraped against the wood as he pawed at a particular board, his movements purposeful and insistent. When he noticed her watching, he looked up at her with an expression that seemed almost pleading, then returned to his scratching. "What is it, boy?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "What are you trying to tell me?" The floorboard he'd been working on was loose, she realized now. When she pressed down on it, it moved slightly, and she could see gaps around the edges that hadn't been visible before. She tried to work her fingers under the edge, but the board was still too tight to lift. Yellow whined softly and pawed at the wood again, more gently this time, as if he were trying to show her something without causing damage. Nahlee went to Uncle Ramon's tool shed and found a crowbar, rusty but functional. Back in the house, she hesitated for a moment before inserting the tool under the loose board. This felt like crossing a line somehow, like opening a door that Uncle Ramon had deliberately kept closed. But Yellow sat beside her, tail wagging encouragingly, and something about his confidence gave her the courage to continue. The board came up with a groan of old nails and settled wood. Beneath it was darkness and the smell of earth and long undisturbed air. Nahlee fetched a flashlight from the kitchen and shone it into the space she'd opened. There, nested in a hollow between the floor joists, was a metal box about the size of a large shoebox. It was wrapped in oiled cloth and appeared to have been placed there deliberately, cushioned with old towels to protect it from moisture and shifting. Her hands shook as she lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than she'd expected, and she could hear papers rustling inside when she moved it. Yellow pressed close to her side, no longer agitated but alert, as if he'd accomplished his mission and was now waiting to see what would happen next. She carried the box to Uncle Ramon's kitchen table and set it down under the overhead light. The metal was tarnished but not rusted, and the cloth wrapping had done its job of protecting the contents from the desert's extremes of heat and cold. A simple latch held the lid closed, but when she tried to open it, her fingers wouldn't cooperate. The magnitude of what she might be about to discover had paralyzed her. What if this was just Uncle Ramon's personal papers, birth certificates, old tax returns, family photographs? What if she was making too much of Yellow's behavior, reading significance into what was simply an animal's curiosity about an unusual smell? But what if it was something more? She took a deep breath and lifted the latch. The box was packed with documents, some in manila envelopes, others bound with rubber bands that crumbled at her touch. On top was a torn photograph, black and white and obviously old, showing Uncle Ramon as a much younger man, standing with a group of white men in work clothes. They were posed in front of what looked like surveying equipment, with railroad tracks visible in the background. Uncle Ramon's face was serious, almost grim, and she noticed that he stood slightly apart from the others, as if he didn't quite belong to their group. Beneath the photograph were official-looking papers with ornate letterheads and formal seals. As she lifted them into the light, words jumped out at her: railroad land grant, bond certificate, bearer security, and numbers that made her vision blur. $5,000, $10,000, $25,000. The dates were from the 1940s and 1950s. But even accounting for inflation, she was looking at enormous sums of money. Her legs went weak, and she had to sit down heavily in Uncle Ramon's wooden chair. Yellow whined softly and nudged her hand with his nose, as if he could sense her distress. "This can't be real," she whispered, but her voice sounded strange in the quiet kitchen. She picked up another document, this one a certificate for gold holdings in a Denver bank, dated 1953. The amount made her gasp: $50,000 in gold. When an ounce of the precious metal cost $35, document after document revealed the same pattern. Bonds, certificates, promissory notes, all bearing Uncle Ramon's name, and all representing wealth that seemed impossible for a railroad worker to have accumulated through honest wages. Some of the papers were in Uncle Ramon's handwriting, careful notes about dates and amounts and names she didn't recognize. Others were official documents with raised seals and multiple signatures. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in its own piece of oiled cloth, was a small leather journal. The cover was worn smooth with handling, and when she opened it, she found page after page of her uncle's careful script, dates going back decades. The entries were brief but detailed, recording meetings, conversations, and what appeared to be business transactions. March 15, 1947, met with Hartwell and Morrison at the surveyor's camp. They want me to verify the boundary markers are correctly placed. Offered me $500 to keep quiet about the discrepancies. Told them I needed time to think. April 2, 1947, discovered the railroad grant maps don't match the tribal boundary documents. They're claiming an extra 1,000 acres that rightfully belongs to the Apache. Hartwell says it's just a clerical error, but Morrison was nervous. May 10, 1947, accepted their offer. God forgive me. But with this money, I can send the children to school, help the families who lost everything in the drought. Sometimes you have to work within a corrupt system to do any good at all. Nahlee's hands trembled as she read. Uncle Ramon hadn't just worked for the railroad. He'd been part of something larger, something that involved the systematic theft of Apache land. But instead of simply profiting from the corruption, he'd documented it, keeping careful records of every transaction, every meeting, every compromise of his conscience. The later entries revealed a different Ramon, one who'd grown increasingly troubled by his role in the deception. June 30th, 1952. Can't sleep. Every dollar I've taken is stained with the blood of our people. But if I stop now, if I refuse to cooperate, they'll find someone else to do the work, someone who won't keep records. At least this way, someday there might be a reckoning. December 12th, 1960. Young Hartwell, Richard Jr., is even worse than his father. Wants to expand the operation, claims there are oil deposits under the sacred mountain. I told him the surveying equipment showed no such thing, but he says they have other sources. I think I may be in danger. The final entries were more recent, written in the shaking hand of an old man. September 3rd, 1987, someone broke into the house while I was in town. Nothing taken, but they went through my papers. The Hartwells know I have evidence. Maria Santos thinks I'm being paranoid, but I can feel them watching. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find these records and finish what I started. Nahlee closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness of the kitchen. Yellow pressed against her legs like a warm, living anchor to reality. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the desert. But inside, the silence was complete, except for the rapid beating of her heart. Uncle Ramon hadn't just left her a house and 40 acres of scrubland. He'd left her a fortune built on the betrayal of their people and the evidence to expose a conspiracy that had lasted for decades. The documents in this box represented millions of dollars in today's money, but they also represented something far more valuable and dangerous: the truth about how their sacred lands had been stolen and who had profited from the theft. Yellow looked up at her with those intelligent dark eyes, and for the first time since she'd found him, she wondered if his appearance at her door had been as random as she'd assumed. Uncle Ramon had been a careful man, a planner. If he'd trained a dog to guard his secrets, to lead the right person to this evidence when the time was right, then Yellow's loyalty and intelligence suddenly made a different kind of sense. She was still sitting there, surrounded by the explosive contents of Uncle Ramon's hidden box, when she heard the sound of a car engine approaching on the dirt road. The first vehicle she'd heard since arriving at the Adobe house 4 days ago. Nahlee quickly closed the metal box and pushed it behind the flour canister on the kitchen counter, her heart racing as the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder. Yellow's ears were pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, not the welcoming sound of a dog greeting familiar visitors, but the warning of a guard animal sensing potential threat. The engine cut off outside, followed by the slam of a car door and the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Through the kitchen window, she could see a white pickup truck with government plates and a man in a khaki uniform walking toward the front door. Her relief was immediate, not the mysterious watchers Uncle Ramon had written about, but someone official. Mrs. Yazzie. The man's voice was polite but authoritative as he knocked. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Martinez. I heard you were staying out here, and I wanted to check on you." She opened the door, Yellow pressing close to her side but no longer growling. Deputy Martinez was a middle-aged Hispanic man with kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who spent his time outdoors. His uniform was clean and pressed, his manner professional but not unfriendly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, ma'am. Maria Santos mentioned in town that Ramon's niece was staying out here, and well, it can get pretty isolated. We like to keep an eye on folks, especially—" He paused, seeming to catch himself, "especially old women living alone." Nahlee finished with a slight smile. He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Especially anyone living this far from help, Mom. Cell service is spotty out here, and if you had a medical emergency or needed assistance—" They talked for a few minutes on the front porch, Martinez explaining the local emergency procedures and giving her his card with direct numbers. He seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare, but Nahlee noticed how his eyes kept moving past her to scan the interior of the house, and how he asked several questions about Uncle Ramon's belongings and whether she'd found anything unusual while cleaning up. After he left, she stood on the porch watching his truck disappear down the dirt road, Yellow still alert at her side. The visit had been perfectly reasonable, the kind of community policing that made sense in rural areas. But something about the timing, just hours after her discovery, felt too convenient to be coincidental. The next morning, she drove into the nearest town, Esperanza, to buy groceries and supplies. The settlement was little more than a gas station, a general store, and a handful of houses clustered around a main street that had seen better days. But it was here that she found her first real ally in understanding Uncle Ramon's secret life. Maria Santos ran the general store, a comfortable woman in her 60s who had known Uncle Ramon for decades. When Nahlee introduced herself, Maria's face lit up with genuine warmth and sadness. "Ramon talked about you often," Maria said, leading her to a quiet corner near the coffee pot. "He was so proud when your children graduated college, so worried when your husband got sick. He carried your family in his heart." They talked for an hour, Maria sharing stories about Uncle Ramon's later years, his regular trips to town for supplies, his quiet generosity when families were struggling, his habit of reading every newspaper and magazine she could order for the store. "He was always studying something," Maria recalled. "History books, maps, legal documents." Said he was trying to understand how things got so broken for our people. I used to tease him about being a scholar, but he took it all very seriously. When Nahlee carefully asked about Uncle Ramon's work with the railroad, Maria's expression grew more guarded. "That was before my time here, but my father remembered those days." Said Ramon was one of the few Apache men who could get steady work with the railroad company, doing surveying and checking boundary lines. Good pay, but it took him away from the reservation for months at a time. She paused, pouring fresh coffee for both of them. In his later years, though, Ramon seemed troubled by those times. He'd get letters sometimes, official-looking things that would make him angry or worried. And there were visitors, men in suits who'd drive out to his place and stay for hours. He never talked about what they wanted, but afterward he'd be moody for days. That afternoon, Nahlee drove to the tribal offices in Mescalero, carrying Uncle Ramon's railroad surveyor's compass, an instrument she'd found in his bedroom dresser, brass and steel aged to a warm patina. The compass was obviously old and well used, its needle still true despite decades of wear. Elder Joseph Begay was in his 80s, one of the few people left who remembered the railroad days personally. He received her in the traditional way, offering prayers in Apache before they spoke in English. When she showed him the compass and asked about Uncle Ramon's work, his weathered face grew serious. "Your uncle was a bridge between worlds," Joseph said slowly. "The white men needed someone who knew the land, who could read the old markers and understand the sacred boundaries. Ramon knew more about this country than any man alive, every canyon, every water source, every place where our ancestors made camp." He held the compass carefully, turning it over in his hands, but there was a price for that knowledge. The railroad company didn't just want him to survey their right-of-way. They wanted him to help them adjust the boundary lines, make their land grants look legal when they grabbed more than they were entitled to. Joseph's eyes met hers, and she saw both sadness and anger in their depths. "We lost hundreds of thousands of acres in those years. Land that had been ours since the beginning of time, taken with false surveys and forged documents. Some of us suspected, but we had no proof. And the few Apache men who worked with the railroad, they kept quiet. They had to survive." That evening, Nahlee sat at Uncle Ramon's kitchen table with the compass before her and the hidden documents spread around her. The brass instrument seemed to connect all the pieces. Uncle Ramon's expertise had made him valuable to men who wanted to steal Apache land, but his conscience had made him document their crimes. She began making careful lists of the names mentioned in Uncle Ramon's journal, cross-referencing them with the signatures on the bonds and certificates. Patterns emerged. The same families appeared again and again across decades of transactions. The Hartwells, the Morrisons, the Whitcombs, names that still appeared on street signs and business establishments in the region. Her phone rang as she worked, startling her in the quiet house. Sarah's number showed on the screen. "Mom, how are you managing out there?" Her daughter's voice was warm but concerned. "I've been worrying about you in that isolated place." They talked for 20 minutes, Nahlee carefully editing her responses to avoid mentioning her discoveries. But when Sarah asked if she'd found anything valuable among Uncle Ramon's belongings, The question felt pointed in a way that made Nahlee uncomfortable. "Just some old tools and books," she said. "Nothing that would interest anyone else." "Good," Sarah said, and there was relief in her voice that Nahlee didn't understand. "I mean, good that you're not overwhelmed with a lot of complicated estate issues. You have enough to deal with, just deciding what to do with the property." After she hung up, Nahlee sat in the growing darkness, wondering why her daughter had seemed so interested in Uncle Ramon's belongings, and why her relief at hearing there was nothing valuable had sounded almost like gratitude. Yellow lay at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds she couldn't hear. In the distance, she could see the lights of a vehicle moving slowly along the main road, too far away to be headed anywhere but back toward town. But something about its pace, deliberate, searching, made her think of Deputy Martinez's visit and his careful questions about Uncle Ramon's possessions. She was beginning to understand that her uncle's secrets had tentacles that reached far beyond this isolated Adobe house, and that her discovery of his hidden evidence had already set forces in motion that she didn't yet comprehend. The next morning brought unwelcome visitors. Nahlee was tending Uncle Ramon's small vegetable garden when she heard engines approaching. Not one vehicle this time, but two. Yellow immediately went on alert, positioning himself between her and the sound. His hackles raised in a way she'd never seen before. Two black SUVs with tinted windows pulled into the driveway, their occupants remaining inside for several minutes before the doors opened. 4 men in expensive suits emerged, clearly not locals. Their leader was a tall, silver-haired man in his 60s, who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Yazzie?" His voice was smooth, practiced. "I'm Richard Hartwell, Jr. I represent certain business interests in the region. I wondered if we might have a word." The name hit her like a physical blow. Hartwell, one of the families repeatedly mentioned in Uncle Ramon's journal. She kept her expression neutral, but Yellow pressed closer to her side, a low growl vibrating in his chest. "I'm rather busy, Mr. Hartwell. What kind of business interests?" His smile never wavered, but she noticed how his companions spread out slightly, flanking her. "Land development, primarily. I understand you've inherited this property, and I wanted to discuss a potential purchase. We're prepared to make a very generous offer, well above market value." She'd found a collection of business cards in Uncle Ramon's papers the night before. Cards from lawyers, land developers, and politicians dating back decades. Many bore the Hartwell name, creating a family tree of corruption that spanned 3 generations. "I'm not interested in selling," she said simply. Hartwell's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps you should consider our offer before making that decision. This is isolated country, Mrs. Yazzie, dangerous for someone living alone. We'd hate for anything unfortunate to happen." It wasn't quite a threat, but the implication was clear. Yellow's growling grew louder, and she noticed the dog had positioned himself where he could see all 4 men. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Hartwell?" "Of course not. I'm simply pointing out the realities of desert living. Wild animals, flash floods, medical emergencies. A woman your age should think seriously about the risks." After they left, Nahlee sat on her front porch with shaking hands, finally understanding the full scope of what Uncle Ramon had uncovered. The Hartwell family had been stealing Apache land for generations, and they clearly believed Uncle Ramon's property contained something they wanted, or something that threatened them. That afternoon, she drove to the county courthouse in the larger town of Roswell, carrying a folder of Uncle Ramon's documents. The courthouse records revealed a pattern that made her stomach turn. Property after property that had once belonged to Apache families had been transferred to Hartwell development companies through questionable legal proceedings, tax lines for impossibly small amounts, eminent domain claims that had never been properly challenged, and boundary disputes that had always been resolved in favor of white landowners. The current city council included 2 Hartwell family members, and the county planning commission was chaired by a Morrison, another name from Uncle Ramon's list. The conspiracy wasn't just historical, it was ongoing, an institutional theft that had been perfected over decades. At the courthouse, she met David Crow Feather, a young Apache lawyer who worked for the Tribal Legal Services Office. When she explained her situation carefully, mentioning Uncle Ramon's concerns about land theft, but not revealing the full extent of her discoveries, his reaction was immediate and serious. "Your uncle contacted our office several times over the years," David told her in his small, cluttered office. "He claimed to have evidence of systematic fraud in the railroad land grants of the 1940s and 50s, but he was never willing to share specifics. Said it was too dangerous." David pulled out a thick file. "We've suspected for years that the Hartwells and their associates have been operating some kind of long-term land grab scheme, but we've never had enough evidence to build a case. The statute of limitations has run out on most of the original thefts, but if there was ongoing fraud or conspiracy..." That evening her phone rang again. This time it was Miguel calling from Denver, and his voice carried a tension she'd rarely heard from her usually calm son. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Have you found anything unusual at Uncle Ramon's place? Any documents or papers that might be valuable?" The question was so similar to Sarah's that Nahlee felt a chill run down her spine. "Why are you asking?" "I had some visitors today at my office, men who said they represented parties interested in purchasing Uncle Ramon's estate. They seemed to know a lot about our family, about you being there alone. They made it clear that they were prepared to pay well above market value for a quick sale." Miguel paused, and she could hear traffic noise in the background, as if he was calling from his car. "Mom, these weren't normal land developers. They knew things. About my mortgage, about Sarah's bank loans, about details of our lives that shouldn't be public information. When I told them you weren't interested in selling, they suggested that circumstances might change your mind." After the call, Nahlee sat in Uncle Ramon's kitchen, staring at the hidden documents. Her children were being pressured, possibly threatened, because of her discovery. The conspiracy reached far enough to track down her family members in distant cities and dig into their private financial information. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her think of intruders, and Yellow seemed equally restless, pacing between the front and back doors like a sentry on patrol. Around midnight, she heard a vehicle engine idling somewhere nearby, not moving, just sitting in the darkness beyond the reach of her porch light. She turned off all the lights in the house and crept to a window, peering through a gap in the curtains. A quarter-mile down the road, she could make out the silhouette of a truck parked in the shadow of a large boulder. It stayed there for 2 hours before driving away without lights. The next morning, she found evidence that someone had been walking around her property during the night. Footprints in the soft earth near her bedroom window. Tire tracks where a vehicle had turned around in the desert behind the house. Yellow investigated each sign with intense interest, his nose working over scents she couldn't detect. She was being watched. Her children were being pressured, and somewhere out there, powerful people were growing increasingly desperate to get their hands on whatever Uncle Ramon had hidden. The bonds and certificates in the metal box were worth millions, but Nahlee was beginning to understand that they represented something far more valuable to the Hartwell family. They were evidence of crimes that could destroy reputations, end political careers, and reverse decades of illegal land acquisitions. But with that realization came another, more frightening thought. If these people were willing to threaten her children to get what they wanted, what would they do if they discovered she'd already found Uncle Ramon's evidence? As she sat at the kitchen table that evening, cataloguing the names and dates from Uncle Ramon's careful records, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The most recent entry in his journal, dated just 2 months before his death, mentioned a phone call from someone claiming to represent Sarah's bank in Phoenix. Someone had been watching her family long before she'd ever set foot in this Adobe house. 3 days after Hartwell's visit, Nahlee made a discovery that changed everything. While searching through Uncle Ramon's bedroom dresser for more hidden documents, she found a hand-drawn map tucked behind a family photograph. The map was detailed and precise, showing not just property boundaries, but sacred Apache sites, springs, burial grounds, ceremonial areas that had been considered untouchable for generations. What made her hands shake as she studied the map was the overlay of modern development, shopping centers, housing subdivisions, and commercial buildings that had been constructed directly on top of places that should have remained sacred. Each desecrated site was marked with a red X and a date, creating a timeline of cultural destruction that spanned decades. The Hartwell name appeared repeatedly in the margins, along with notes about zoning changes, environmental impact waivers, and archaeological surveys that had somehow overlooked obvious signs of ancient occupation. Uncle Ramon had documented not just financial theft, but spiritual genocide, the systematic destruction of Apache heritage for profit. She was still absorbing the implications when Yellow began his familiar alert behavior, ears pricked toward the front of the house. Through the window she saw a silver sedan with government plates approaching, different from Deputy Martinez's truck. The woman who emerged was perhaps 40 years old, with the strong features and dark complexion that marked her as Native American. She wore a professional pantsuit and carried herself with quiet authority, but her approach to the front door was respectful, almost ceremonial. "Mrs. Yazzie, I'm FBI agent Lisa Redhorse. I'm investigating some irregularities in federal land grants from the 1940s and 50s. I believe your uncle may have possessed information relevant to our inquiry." Agent Redhorse was Apache, from the White Mountain Band in Arizona, and when she spoke their shared language in greeting, Nahlee felt a profound sense of relief. Here, finally, was someone who might understand both the legal and cultural significance of what Uncle Ramon had preserved. They sat on the front porch while Redhorse explained her investigation. The FBI had been quietly looking into patterns. A fraud in railroad land grants across the Southwest, triggered by new evidence of systematic corruption that had cost various tribes millions of acres of ancestral territory. "Your uncle contacted our Phoenix office several years ago," Redhorse said carefully. "He claimed to have documentation of an ongoing conspiracy to defraud Native American communities of their land rights. But when our agents tried to interview him, he became frightened and refused to cooperate." Nahlee studied the agent's face, trying to read her intentions. Trust didn't come easily, after a lifetime of watching government officials make promises they didn't keep. "Why should I believe the FBI is interested in justice for Apache people?" Redhorse's expression was understanding. "Because I'm Apache too, Mrs. Yazzie. Because my grandmother lost her family's allotment to the same kind of legal theft your uncle documented. And because some crimes are too big for anyone to ignore forever." That afternoon, after careful consideration and prayer, Nahlee showed Agent Redhorse the contents of Uncle Ramon's hidden box. The federal agent's reaction was immediate and intense. She recognized several names from other cases, saw patterns that connected to investigations in multiple states. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Redhorse said, photographing documents with careful attention to chain of custody. "Your uncle kept better records than most law enforcement agencies. These bonds alone represent millions in today's money, but the real value is in the evidence of federal crimes." As they worked through the documents together, a larger picture emerged. Uncle Ramon hadn't just been a reluctant participant in land theft. He'd been a federal informant, secretly gathering evidence for a case that had been building for decades. His death had derailed the investigation, scattering the FBI team and leaving the evidence hidden. "We suspected he'd hidden documentation somewhere," Redhorse explained, "but without his cooperation, we had no way to find it. The case went cold, and some of the worst perpetrators have spent the last few years thinking they were safe." That evening, after Agent Redhorse left with copies of the most crucial documents, Nahlee sat with Uncle Ramon's map spread across the kitchen table. Yellow lay at her feet, calmer now that the federal agent had left, but still alert to every sound from outside. She traced the red X marks with her finger, each one representing a sacred site that had been violated for profit. The pattern was Systematic and devastating. Water sources diverted, burial grounds paved over, ceremonial areas turned into strip malls and parking lots. The Hartwell family and their associates hadn't just stolen land, they'd erased Apache history itself. Her contemplation was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching much faster than was safe on the dirt road. This time, Yellow didn't, just alert. He launched himself toward the front door, barking with an intensity that made Nahlie's blood run cold. Through the window, she saw Hartwell's black SUVs returning, but their approach was different now, aggressive, urgent. The vehicles skidded to a stop, and men emerged quickly, no longer maintaining the pretense of polite business discussion. Hartwell himself strode to her front door and pounded on it with his fist, his earlier smooth manner completely gone. "Mrs. Yazzie, open this door. We know you've been talking to federal agents. We need to discuss this situation before you make a terrible mistake." She didn't answer, instead moving to Uncle Ramon's bedroom, where she could see the back of the property. A third vehicle was approaching from that direction, cutting off any escape route. They'd surrounded the house. "We're not going away, Mrs. Yazzie," Hartwell called through the door. "Your uncle made a deal with us years ago. He took our money, he signed our agreements, and now you're bound by those contracts. If you think the federal government is going to protect you, you're more naive than we thought." Yellow was pressed against her side, every muscle tense, when she heard the sound that changed everything. Another vehicle approaching, this one with a distinctive rumble that seemed familiar. Through the front window, she saw Agent Redhorse's sedan returning, followed by 2 additional FBI vehicles with their emergency lights flashing. The confrontation that followed was brief but revealing, when federal agents surrounded Hartwell and his men, demanding to see identification and asking pointed questions about their presence on Nahlie's property. The land developer's mask slipped completely. "This is a private business matter," he snarled at Agent Redhorse. "That woman is in possession of stolen property that belongs to my family, documents that were taken illegally from our offices decades ago." "Interesting," Redhorse replied calmly. "Because according to our investigation, those documents were created by Nahlee Yazzie as part of his work as a federal informant. That makes them government evidence, not private property." As the FBI agents escorted Hartwell and his men away from the property, he turned back toward Nahlee with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over, old woman. We've been protecting our interests in this region for 70 years. Your uncle learned what happens to people who cross us, and so will you." The threat was clear and public, made in front of federal agents who immediately began discussing protective custody. But as Nahlee watched the taillights of Hartwell's vehicles disappear into the desert darkness, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The fierce, determined anger of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. Uncle Ramon's map wasn't just evidence of crimes against Apache people. It was a guide to reclaiming their stolen heritage, one sacred site at a time. The sacred turquoise medallion was wrapped in soft deerskin at the very bottom of Uncle Ramon's hidden box, beneath even his most sensitive documents. When Nahlee unwrapped it the morning after Hartwell's threatening visit, she gasped with recognition. It had belonged to her great-grandmother, a piece of ancient turquoise, carved with traditional Apache symbols and set in silver that had been worked by her ancestors' hands. She hadn't seen it since childhood, when great-grandmother had worn it during ceremonies. The family had assumed it was lost when the old woman died. But now Nahlee understood that Uncle Ramon had kept it safe, along with all the other treasures he'd been protecting. The medallion seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, connecting her to generations of Apache women who had worn it before her. Agent Redhorse arrived that morning with a federal forensics team and a plan to systematically document every piece of evidence Uncle Ramon had preserved. The Adobe house became a temporary FBI field office, with agents cataloging documents, photographing artifacts, and building a case that would reach back decades. We've identified at least 40 separate incidents of federal crimes, Red Horse explained as they worked. Wire fraud, conspiracy, violations of the Indian Reorganization Act, and systematic civil rights violations. Some of the statutes have no limitations period when they involve ongoing conspiracy. The investigation revealed the true scope of Uncle Ramon's work as an informant. For 30 years, he'd been gathering evidence not just about the Hartwell family, but about a network of corruption that included local politicians, state officials, and even federal bureaucrats who had looked the other way in exchange for bribes or political favors. Your uncle was incredibly brave, Red Horse said, as they examined his meticulous records. He knew the risks, but he kept working because he believed someday there would be a reckoning. He just never lived to see it. That afternoon, Elder Joseph Begay arrived with 3 other tribal council members, drawn by news that the decades-old land theft conspiracy was finally being exposed. They brought with them oral histories that corroborated Uncle Ramon's written records, stories passed down through families about sacred sites that had been destroyed, water rights that had been stolen, and young Apache men who had died under suspicious circumstances after threatening to expose the truth. Ramon came to us many times over the years, Elder Begay said, his weathered hands holding Uncle Ramon's turquoise medallion with reverence. He wanted to share what he'd learned, but we were afraid. We'd seen what happened to people who challenged the white power structure. We told him to stay quiet, to protect himself and his family. The elder's voice was heavy with regret. We failed him. We should have supported his fight for justice instead of counseling silence. Maybe if we'd been braver, he wouldn't have carried this burden alone for so long. As the day progressed, more Apache families began arriving at the Adobe house. Word was spreading through the reservation community that evidence had finally surfaced to prove what many had long suspected. Each family brought their own stories of loss. Grandparents who had been cheated out of their allotments, sacred sites that had been desecrated, children who had been denied their birthright. Maria Santos arrived in the afternoon with food for the investigators and news from town. The Hartwell family is calling in favors, she reported quietly. The sheriff's office is claiming this is all a misunderstanding, and the mayor is talking about economic damage to the community. They're fighting back hard, but Maria also brought encouraging news. Dr. William Thornton from the university called the store looking for you. He's a historian who's been researching railroad corruption for years. Says he has documents that support what your uncle discovered, and he wants to help. Dr. Thornton arrived that evening, a tall, thin man in his 70s with the passionate intensity of someone who had dedicated his life to uncovering historical truth. His car was packed with boxes of research materials, and his excitement at meeting Nahlee was immediately apparent. Your uncle was a legend among researchers, he said, as they spread his maps and documents across Uncle Ramon's kitchen table. I've been trying to prove the existence of systematic land fraud in the Southwest for decades, but I never had the kind of inside documentation he preserved. Dr. Thornton's research revealed the national scope of what Uncle Ramon had uncovered. Similar patterns of corruption existed in Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, all involving the same network of railroad companies, land developers, and government officials who had perfected a system for stealing Native American land with legal impunity. They called it the Indian problem solution, Thornton explained, showing Nahlee correspondence between various conspirators. The goal was to break up tribal land holdings so completely that native communities would disappear entirely. They nearly succeeded. As evening fell, Nahlee found herself surrounded by more people than the Adobe house had probably seen in decades. FBI agents worked methodically through Uncle Ramon's evidence. Tribal leaders shared stories that filled in gaps in the historical record. And Dr. Thornton connected her uncle's discoveries to his broader research into institutional racism and legal theft. Yellow seemed to approve of the activity, moving from person to person as if he were checking on everyone's work. Agent Red Horse noticed his behavior and asked about his background. We think he might have been Uncle Ramon's partner in more ways than one, Nahlee explained. He's too well trained to be a stray. and he knew exactly where to find the hidden evidence. Ramon might have taught him to guard these secrets. As if responding to his name, Yellow trotted to the kitchen counter and pawed at a spot where Nahlee hadn't thought to look. When she moved the coffee canister, she found another loose floorboard, one that revealed a small cache containing additional documents and a set of keys. One of the keys opened a safety deposit box at a bank in Roswell, which Agent Redhorse arranged to search the next morning. The anticipation was electric. After finding so much evidence already, everyone wondered what final secrets Uncle Ramon might have preserved. But that night, as the investigators finally left and Nahlee sat alone with Yellow in the restored quiet of the Adobe house, she felt the weight of her uncle's legacy settling on her shoulders. The evidence they'd uncovered would destroy the Hartwell family's empire and return millions of dollars worth of land to Apache control. But it would also make her a target for people who had killed to protect their secrets before. She held her great-grandmother's turquoise medallion and felt the strength of all the Apache women who had worn it before her. They had survived conquest and displacement, poverty and prejudice. Now it was her turn to carry on that legacy of survival and resistance. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the voices of ancestors who had never stopped fighting for justice, even when the living had given up hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, Nahlee felt connected to something larger than herself, the unbreakable spirit of a people who had never truly surrendered. The medallion seemed to pulse with warmth against her chest, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly alive. The safety deposit box in Roswell contained Uncle Ramon's most explosive secret, a leather-bound diary that revealed he hadn't just been documenting the conspiracy. He'd been a federal informant for the FBI for over 30 years. But more shocking than his official status was what the diary revealed about his death. September 15, 1987. They know. Hartwell Jr. confronted me today at the post office, said they'd been watching my mail, knew I was in contact with federal agents. He didn't threaten me directly, but the message was clear. I need to move the evidence to a safer location. October 3rd, 1987. Found my water well poisoned this morning. All my cattle are dead. This wasn't random. The timing is too convenient. They're escalating the pressure, trying to force me to abandon the investigation. October 20th, 1987. Maria Santos warned me that strangers have been asking about my routine in town. Sheriff Morrison, yes, another family name from my list, told her they were concerned citizens, worried about an old man living alone. But Maria said they knew too much about my habits, my schedule, my visitors, the final entries, written in Uncle Ramon's increasingly shaky handwriting, painted a picture of a man who knew his time was running out. November 2nd, 1987. My chest pains are getting worse, but I don't dare go to the hospital in town. Too many people on the Hartwell payroll work there. If something happens to me, I pray someone will find these records and finish what I started. The truth cannot die with me. November 4th, 1987. This will be my last entry. The dog I've been training, Scout I call him, understands his job. He knows where the evidence is hidden, and he'll wait for the right person to arrive. If you're reading this, it means he chose you. Trust him. He's smarter than most people give him credit for. Agent Redhorse read the diary entries aloud, while Nahlee sat in stunned silence. Yellow Scout lay at her feet, his intelligent eyes seeming to understand every word. Uncle Ramon's death hadn't been natural, as everyone had assumed. It had been murder, disguised as a heart attack, but actually the result of a slow-acting poison that had taken weeks to kill him. The autopsy from 1987 shows elevated levels of digitalis in his system, Redhorse said, consulting FBI medical records. At the time, it was dismissed as a medication error. Digitalis is used to treat heart conditions. But the levels were far higher than therapeutic doses, and Ramon had never been prescribed heart medication. The diary also revealed hidden audio recordings that Uncle Ramon had made of his conversations with conspirators, using equipment provided by the FBI, the recordings were stored in a concealed compartment. In Scout's collar, a detail that explained the dog's protective behavior whenever strangers approached. When Agent Redhorse carefully examined Scout's leather collar, she found the hidden mechanism that Uncle Ramon had described. Inside were micro-cassette tapes, dozens of them, containing conversations that would destroy half the political establishment in the region. Nahlee listened to her uncle's voice for the first time in years as the tapes played. His calm, Apache-accented English alternating with the harsh voices of men who spoke casually about stealing millions of dollars worth of land from those damn Indians who don't know what to do with it anyway. One recording was particularly damning, a 1985 conversation between Richard Hartwell Sr. and current Sheriff Morrison, in which they discussed the Ramon problem and debated various solutions for silencing the old Apache man permanently. "We can't just make him disappear," Morrison's voice said on the tape. "Too many people know he exists. But if he had some kind of medical emergency, something that looked natural." "I know a doctor who owes us favors," Hartwell Sr. replied. "Someone who could provide the right kind of medication error. Make it look like the old man's heart finally gave out." The recordings provided undeniable proof of murder conspiracy, transforming the case from historical fraud to active homicide investigation. But they also revealed something even more disturbing. The network of corruption included current officials who were still in power, still profiting from the same system of theft that had killed Uncle Ramon. "Sheriff Morrison is still in office," Agent Redhorse said grimly. "He's been investigating your uncle's death for 36 years, making sure no one looked too closely at the evidence. And the doctor who signed the death certificate? His son now runs the county hospital where your uncle died." That afternoon brought visitors that Nahlee hadn't expected. Her children, Sarah and Miguel, driving up in separate cars with expressions of worry and confusion. Their arrival felt too convenient, too well-timed, given everything that had been happening. "Mom, what's going on?" Sarah demanded as she climbed out of her SUV. "I got calls at work from reporters asking about Uncle Ramon and some kind of FBI investigation. People are saying you've been making accusations against prominent families." Miguel was equally agitated. "I flew down from Denver because my partners are getting calls from other law firms asking about our family's involvement in some kind of federal case. My reputation could be seriously damaged if this turns into a circus." Agent Redhorse watched the family reunion with careful attention, and Nahlee noticed the federal agent's hand resting near her service weapon, a precaution that seemed extreme until Sarah's next words revealed why it was necessary. "Mom, Mr. Hartwell called me personally yesterday. He explained that Uncle Ramon had been suffering from dementia in his final years, making wild accusations about imaginary conspiracies. He said you might have found some of Ramon's confused writings and misunderstood their significance." The casual way Sarah repeated Hartwell's talking points sent chills down Nahlee's spine. Either her daughter had been completely manipulated, or she was actively working with the people who had murdered Uncle Ramon. "Sarah," Nahlee said carefully, "how exactly did Mr. Hartwell get your personal phone number? And why would a land developer in New Mexico be calling a bank manager in Phoenix about family matters?" The question seemed to catch Sarah off guard. She glanced at Miguel, then back at her mother, and for a moment her confident manner wavered. "He said he was trying to help, that he was concerned about you living alone out here, making yourself vulnerable to people who might take advantage of your grief." Miguel stepped forward, his lawyer's training evident in how he framed his words. "Mom, I think we should consider accepting Hartwell's offer to purchase this property. You could use the money to relocate closer to one of us, somewhere safer and more comfortable." It was then that Nahlee understood the full scope of the conspiracy. Her children weren't willing participants, but they'd been carefully manipulated over years of subtle contact with Hartwell associates. Their mortgages, their business loans, their children's school arrangements, all of it had been influenced by people who wanted leverage over Uncle Ramon's family. Scout seemed to sense the tension in the conversation. He moved closer to Nahlee, positioning himself between her and her children in a way that made Agent Redhorse take notice. "It's interesting," the FBI agent said quietly, "that both of your children received personal calls from Hartwell within hours of our beginning this investigation. That suggests a level of surveillance and coordination that goes well beyond normal business interests." The realization that her own children had been turned against her, however unwillingly, was devastating. But it also clarified the stakes involved. This wasn't just about recovering stolen land or exposing historical crimes. It was about breaking a system of control that had manipulated Apache families for generations, using their own children as weapons against them. As evening fell and her children reluctantly agreed to stay the night, under FBI protection, Redhorse insisted, Nahlee sat on the front porch with Scout and listened to the desert wind. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation, the moment when decades of carefully hidden truth would finally be exposed to the world. But tonight, she mourned for her uncle, who had died alone and afraid, and for her children, who had been robbed of their heritage so completely that they couldn't recognize justice when it finally arrived. The turquoise medallion felt heavy against her chest, carrying the weight of all the Apache women who had fought and lost before her. But this time would be different. This time, the truth had allies, evidence, and a federal agent who understood that some crimes were too important to let the perpetrators escape justice. The final piece of Uncle Ramon's puzzle was hidden in the last place anyone would think to look, a sealed plastic container buried beneath the flagstone floor of his small workshop. Scout led them there at dawn, pawing insistently at one particular stone until Agent Redhorse brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment to confirm what the dog already knew. Inside the container were Uncle Ramon's audio recordings from 1987, the weeks leading up to his murder. His voice, growing weaker and more frightened with each passing day, documented the final moves in a deadly chess game that had cost him his life. November 1st, 1987, Dr. Whitcomb came to the house today, said he'd heard I was having chest pains and wanted to check on me. I didn't let him in, but he left a bottle of heart medication just in case. I know better than to trust anything from that family. The pills are probably what killed the Morrison boy in '73 when he threatened to talk about the water rights theft. But the most devastating recording was Uncle Ramon's final video testimony, shot on an old camera and stored on magnetic tape that had somehow survived 36 years of desert conditions. In the grainy footage, a dying man looked directly into the camera and named every conspirator, detailed every crime, and provided specific locations where additional evidence could be found. "My name is Nahlee Yazzie, and if you're watching this, it means they succeeded in killing me," his recorded voice said with quiet dignity. "But they failed to kill the truth. Everything I've documented, every stolen acre, every forged document, every murdered witness, it's all real, and it's all preserved for future generations to discover." The video included a detailed map of locations throughout the Southwest where the conspiracy had buried evidence of their crimes, confident that no one would ever think to look for it. Uncle Ramon had spent decades secretly visiting these sites, photographing buried documents and recording GPS coordinates for future investigators. Agent Redhorse immediately contacted the FBI field offices in Phoenix, Denver, and Salt Lake City, requesting simultaneous raids on the locations Uncle Ramon had identified. The scope of the investigation was expanding beyond anything anyone had imagined. This wasn't just about stolen Apache land in New Mexico, but a regional conspiracy that had defrauded dozens of tribes across multiple states. "We're looking at the largest case of systematic fraud against Native Americans in U.S. history," Redhorse told Nahlee as federal agents prepared for coordinated searches. "Your uncle documented crimes that total in the hundreds of millions of dollars, affecting thousands of families over multiple generations." The morning's revelations brought unexpected visitors to the Adobe house. Tribal leaders from across the Southwest began arriving as word spread through Native American communities that decades of systematic theft were finally being exposed. Apache, Navajo, Ute, and Pueblo representatives came with their own stories of mysterious land losses and suspicious deaths of family members who had threatened to speak out. Elder Joseph Begay arrived, with the tribal council's official support, carrying a ceremonial staff that had been passed down through generations of Apache leaders. The staff was carved from sacred wood and adorned with eagle feathers, turquoise and silver, a symbol of legitimate authority that commanded respect even from federal agents. "The council has voted unanimously to support your fight," he told Nahlee in Apache, then repeated it in English for the investigators. "We should have done this decades ago when Ramon first came to us. We won't fail him again." Dr. Thornton arrived with a team of graduate students and documentary filmmakers, all working to preserve the historical record as it unfolded. The elderly historian was beside himself with excitement and grief, realizing that his life's work was being validated even as he mourned the cost in human suffering. "This changes everything we thought we knew about Western expansion," he said, reviewing Uncle Ramon's video testimony. "The systematic nature of the fraud, the coordination between private companies and government officials, this makes the Trail of Tears look like an isolated incident rather than part of a larger pattern of genocide. But the most significant arrival was a convoy of vehicles, bearing tribal nation flags and carrying legal representatives from Apache bands across the region. They brought with them tribal sovereignty lawyers, land rights specialists, and traditional leaders who understood both the legal and spiritual significance of what Uncle Ramon had preserved. Maria Santos arrived with food for the growing crowd and news from town that made everyone tense. "The Hartwell family has hired 3 law firms from Albuquerque and Santa Fe," she reported. "They're claiming this is all a politically motivated attack on successful business families, and they're demanding that the FBI investigation be stopped immediately." More ominously, she'd heard rumors that Sheriff Morrison was organizing concerned citizens to protect the community from what he was calling outside agitators trying to destroy the local economy. The same tactics that had been used to silence Uncle Ramon were being deployed on a larger scale. Agent Red Horse's radio crackled with updates from the simultaneous raids taking place across the Southwest. The first reports were stunning. Hidden caches of documents in Arizona had revealed similar land theft schemes involving congressional representatives and federal judges. In Colorado, investigators had found evidence of murdered tribal activists whose deaths had been covered up for decades. "The pattern is consistent across all locations," Red Horse reported. "Systematic document forgery, witness intimidation, and elimination of anyone who posed a serious threat to the operation. Your uncle wasn't just documenting local corruption. He'd uncovered a regional conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of government." As afternoon approached, the pressure on Nahlee and her supporters intensified. Sarah and Miguel had left that morning after tense conversations with their mother, both clearly torn between family loyalty and the financial pressures being applied by their lenders and employers. Their departure felt like a betrayal, but Nahlee understood that they were victims too, caught in a web of manipulation that had been decades in the making. Scout seemed to sense the approaching crisis. The dog had become increasingly protective, refusing to let anyone approach Nahlee without his approval and maintaining constant vigilance toward the roads leading to the Adobe house. His behavior reminded everyone that he'd been trained by Uncle Ramon to protect not just the evidence, but the people who might be willing to act on it. The afternoon brought a development that changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. Agent Red Horse received a call from FBI headquarters in Washington, informing her that the Justice Department was taking direct control of the case due to its national security implications. "Some of the people named in your uncle's documents currently hold federal positions," she explained to the assembled tribal leaders. This isn't just about historical land theft anymore. It's about ongoing corruption in the Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and possibly even Congress itself. The federal takeover brought resources, but also new dangers. Within hours, the Adobe house was surrounded by FBI tactical teams, and Nahlee found herself at the center of what was being called the most significant federal investigation into crimes against Native Americans since the Wounded Knee trials of the 1970s, but the increased security also attracted increased opposition. By evening, convoy of vehicles had gathered on the main road leading to Uncle Ramon's property, pickup trucks flying Confederate flags, SUVs with anti-government bumper stickers, and cars full of men who claimed to be protecting property rights and constitutional freedoms. Sheriff Morrison arrived with what he called a protective escort, but his true intentions became clear when he demanded that the FBI remove their illegal occupation of private property and return all confiscated materials to their rightful owners. The confrontation between federal agents and local law enforcement was tense but brief. Agent Redhorse presented Morrison with a federal arrest warrant based on the audio recordings of his conversations with the Hartwell family, formally charging him with conspiracy to commit murder and decades of civil rights violations. You can't arrest a sitting sheriff based on the fantasies of a dead Indian, Morrison snarled as federal agents handcuffed him. This whole investigation is politically motivated harassment, and every court in the state will throw it out. But as news crews arrived to film Morrison's perp walk, the assembled tribal leaders began to understand that something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in living memory, white officials were being held accountable for crimes against Native Americans, and the evidence was so overwhelming that the usual legal maneuvering wouldn't be sufficient to avoid justice. As night fell, Nahlee stood on the front porch of Uncle Ramon's Adobe house, surrounded by the largest gathering of Apache people the property had ever seen. Federal agents maintained a security perimeter. Documentary crews recorded the historic moment, and tribal elders conducted ceremonies to honor Uncle Ramon's sacrifice and bless the fight for justice that was finally beginning. Scout sat at her feet, his mission nearly complete, but his vigilance undiminished. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with the Hartwell family and their network of corruption. But tonight belonged to remembrance and preparation. The turquoise medallion felt warm against Nahlee's chest, connecting her to all the Apache women who had fought for their people's survival. She thought about Uncle Ramon, alone and frightened in his final days, wondering if anyone would ever find his evidence and continue his fight. Now he had his answer. The truth he had died to preserve was finally free, and the people he had fought to protect were ready to reclaim what had been stolen from them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in generations, the Apache Nation had the weapons they needed to win. The tribal headquarters had never hosted a gathering like this one. Representatives from 14 Native American nations filled the main hall, along with federal investigators, media crews and community members who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness what many were calling the most important civil rights moment in decades. Nahlee sat at the speaker's table with Uncle Ramon's final video testimony cued on the projection screen behind her, his weathered face frozen in time as he prepared to deliver the words that would topple an empire built on theft and murder. Agent Redhorse had insisted on treating this as an official evidence presentation, with court reporters recording every word and federal marshals providing security. The audience included faces Nahlee recognized from her childhood, elders who had lived through the worst years of the land theft, families who had lost their ancestral homes to legal maneuvers they couldn't fight, young people who had never heard the full scope of what had been stolen from their heritage, but it also included faces she didn't expect to see. Richard Hartwell Jr. sat in the back row with a team of expensive lawyers, his presence both a show of defiance and a calculated legal strategy. If he was going to be accused publicly, he wanted to be present to refute the charges immediately. Dr. Thornton introduced the presentation with historical context, explaining how the systematic theft of Native American land had been disguised as legal business transactions for over a century. His voice carried the authority of decades of research, but also the passion of someone who finally had proof of the crimes he'd suspected all along. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because one Apache man, Nahlee Yazzie, spent 30 years of his life documenting the systematic destruction of Native American land rights in the American Southwest. What you're about to see and hear will forever change our understanding of how economic genocide was carried out against indigenous peoples in the modern era. When Uncle Ramon's video began playing, the silence in the room was complete. His recorded voice, weak but determined, filled the space with words that had waited 36 years to be heard. The Hartwell family has been stealing Apache land since 1943, his image said from the screen. They used forged surveys, bribed officials, and murdered anyone who threatened to expose them. I helped them do it because I was young and poor, and they convinced me that cooperating was the only way to protect my family. I've regretted it every day since. The video continued with specifics that made several lawyers in the audience take frantic notes. Uncle Ramon named names, cited specific transactions, and provided GPS coordinates for physical evidence that federal agents had already confirmed during their raids. But the most powerful moment came when Uncle Ramon looked directly into the camera and spoke to future generations. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and they probably killed me for what I knew. But it also means the truth survived, and that gives me hope. Our people have survived everything they tried to do to us. We'll survive this too. As the video ended, Nahlee stood to address the crowd. Her voice was steady despite the magnitude of the moment, strengthened by the weight of the turquoise medallion against her chest and the knowledge that Scout waited faithfully outside the building. "My uncle died believing he had failed his people," she began. "He thought his cooperation with the conspiracy made him a traitor to everything he'd been taught to hold sacred. But Nahlee Yazzie was no traitor. He was a warrior who fought with the weapons available to him, patience, documentation, and faith that someday the truth would matter more than money or power." She gestured toward the evidence tables where hundreds of documents were displayed under glass, each one representing a piece of stolen heritage that could finally be reclaimed. These papers prove that the Hartwell family and their associates stole over 200,000 acres of Apache land through fraud and murder. But they also prove something more important, that our ancestors never stopped fighting, never stopped documenting the truth, never stopped believing that justice would eventually prevail. The reaction from the audience was immediate and emotional. Elders wept openly as they recognized the names of family members whose mysterious deaths finally made sense. Young people stood to applaud a heritage of resistance they'd never fully understood. The weight of decades of suppressed grief and anger filled the room like a physical presence. But Richard Hartwell Jr. wasn't content to remain silent. He rose from his seat in the back of the room, his expensive suit and confident manner making him stand out among the assembled Native Americans like an invading army of one. "This is nothing but character assassination based on the confused ramblings of a senile old man," he declared, his voice cutting through the emotional atmosphere like a blade. "My family has operated legitimate businesses in this region for generations. We've provided jobs, paid taxes, and contributed to the economic development of communities that had nothing before we arrived." His words sparked immediate anger from the crowd, but Hartwell continued, seemingly oblivious to the hostility his presence had generated. If Nahlee Yazzie had evidence of crimes, why didn't he present it to authorities when he was alive? Why hide documents for decades unless he knew they wouldn't stand up to legal scrutiny? This whole presentation is nothing but a publicity stunt designed to extort money from successful families. The challenge was exactly what Agent Redhorse had been waiting for. She stood and gestured toward the federal marshals positioned around the room. Mr. Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you exercise it." The arrest of Richard Hartwell, Jr., in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple news crews, created a moment of electric tension that seemed to crystallize decades of suppressed anger and hope. As federal marshals approached him with handcuffs, Hartwell's careful composure finally cracked. "You people have no idea who you're dealing with," he snarled, his voice carrying the entitled rage of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. "My family built this region. We created wealth and jobs where there was nothing but empty desert and primitive tribes who couldn't even use the land properly." His words ignited the crowd. Young Apache activists stood and began chanting in their native language, while elders rose with dignity that spoke more powerfully than any shouts. The contrast was stark. Hartwell's desperate anger against the quiet strength of people who had endured generations of exactly this kind of hatred. But Agent Redhorse wasn't finished. She held up the original land deed that Uncle Ramon had preserved, the document that proved Apache ownership of the land where Hartwell's largest shopping center now stood. This deed, signed in 1886, grants 50,000 acres to the Mescalero Apache Nation in perpetuity, she announced. "Your grandfather's railroad company acquired this land through forged documents and bribery. Every building constructed on it, every dollar of profit extracted from it, represents proceeds from criminal enterprise." The legal implications were staggering. If the original Apache land grants were valid, and Uncle Ramon's evidence proved they were, then billions of dollars in current property values would have to be returned to tribal control. Shopping centers, housing developments, and commercial properties across the Southwest would revert to their rightful Native American owners. Hartwell's lawyers immediately began objecting, citing statutes of limitations and arguing that their client was being charged with crimes committed by previous generations. But Agent Redhorse was ready for their legal maneuvering. The conspiracy charge carries no statute of limitations because it involves ongoing criminal enterprise, she explained to the crowd. Every rent payment, every property tax assessment, every business transaction conducted on stolen land constitutes a continuing violation of federal law. As federal agents escorted Hartwell from the building, his parting words revealed the full scope of his family's arrogance. "This won't stand. We have judges, senators, governors on our payroll. You primitive people have no idea how the real world works." But his threats felt hollow in the face of what was unfolding around him. Media crews were broadcasting the proceedings live, and social media was already spreading images of Uncle Ramon's evidence to Native American communities across the country. The story was too big, too well documented, and too morally clear to be suppressed through the usual channels of influence and intimidation. Dr. Thornton approached the microphone as Hartwell was led away, carrying the final piece of Uncle Ramon's evidence, the restored original Apache land deed that had been hidden beneath the floorboards of the Adobe house for 36 years. "This document represents more than legal proof of land ownership," he said, holding the deed carefully in his weathered hands. "It represents the survival of indigenous law, indigenous rights, and indigenous justice, despite everything that has been done to destroy them." The crowd listened in reverent silence as Dr. Thornton read the deed's formal language, written in both English and Apache, recognizing the sovereign rights of the Mescalero Apache Nation over their ancestral territory. The words carried legal weight, but they also carried spiritual significance that resonated through the assembled Native Americans like a prayer finally answered. Nahlee felt the moment's power flow through her as she stood to make the final presentation. Scout had been allowed into the building as her service animal, and he sat beside her with the alert dignity that had made Uncle Ramon choose him as the guardian of these secrets. "Uncle Ramon left us more than evidence," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "He left us a roadmap for reclaiming our heritage and our future. The bonds and certificates in his hidden box are worth $3 million. But they're also seed money for something much more valuable: the restoration of Apache land, Apache culture, and Apache justice. She outlined the plan that had emerged from discussions with tribal leaders, federal investigators, and legal experts. The recovered funds would establish a land reclamation trust, while the legal victories against the Hartwell conspiracy would provide precedent for similar cases across the Southwest. This isn't just about punishing criminals or recovering stolen property, Nahlee continued. It's about healing the wounds that were inflicted on our people for generations and making sure our children inherit the birthright that was nearly taken from them forever. As the formal presentation ended, the crowd began moving toward the display tables where Uncle Ramon's evidence was exhibited. Families found documents relating to their own ancestral lands. Young people discovered the names of relatives whose suspicious deaths finally made sense, and elders pointed out sacred sites that had been desecrated for profit. But the most powerful moment came when Scout approached the display case containing Uncle Ramon's final video testimony. The dog sat quietly in front of the screen where his master's image was frozen, and for several minutes no one in the room moved or spoke. The silence was broken by Elder Joseph Bigay, who began singing a traditional Apache song of victory and mourning, a lament for the dead who had died fighting for justice, and a celebration of the living who would carry on their struggle. As other voices joined the song, Nahlee understood that this was more than a legal victory or a financial recovery. This was the moment when a people who had been scattered and silenced finally found their voice again, and the echo of that voice would be heard for generations to come. 6 months later, Nahlee stood beside the foundation stone of the new Apache Community and Cultural Center, watching as tribal members and their children placed ceremonial objects into the cornerstone that would anchor the building for generations to come. The stone itself was carved from granite quarried on land that had been returned to Apache control through the federal courts, one of the first tangible victories in what was becoming the largest land restoration case in American history. Scout. She still thought of him by that name, though everyone knew his story now, sat beside her with the patient dignity that had made him legendary throughout Indian country. Children from the reservation school visited regularly to hear the story of the dog who had guarded secrets for 36 years, waiting for the right person to trust with the truth that would change everything. The Hartwell family's empire had crumbled completely within 3 months of Richard Jr.'s arrest. Federal investigations had uncovered corruption reaching to the highest levels of state and federal government, resulting in resignations, indictments, and the largest civil rights settlement in history. The recovered lands alone were worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the precedent set by the legal victories was already inspiring similar cases across the country. Sarah arrived from Phoenix with her teenage daughter in tow, both of them carrying items for the cornerstone ceremony. The relationship between Nahlee and her children had been strained for months after they realized how thoroughly they'd been manipulated by the Hartwell conspiracy. But slowly, they were rebuilding trust and understanding their place in a family legacy they'd never fully appreciated. "Mom, Jessica wants to spend the summer here learning Apache from the elders," Sarah said, gesturing toward her daughter, who was photographing every aspect of the ceremony with the intense focus of a teenager discovering her heritage. "She's been researching great-great-uncle Ramon's life for a school project, and she says she wants to be an investigative journalist when she grows up." Miguel had driven down from Denver with his family, and his 2 young sons were running around the construction site with other Apache children, their laughter mixing with the sound of traditional drums and the modern noise of building equipment. The integration of old and new, sacred and practical, seemed natural here in a way that would have made Uncle Ramon proud. Agent Redhorse had been promoted to head a new federal task force investigating historical crimes against Native Americans, and she'd returned for the ceremony both as a representative of the Justice Department and as an Apache woman, honoring a warrior who had fought for their people's survival. She brought news that investigations based on Uncle Ramon's model were now active in 12 states, with evidence surfacing of similar conspiracies that had robbed tribes of millions of acres over the past century. Your uncle started something that's becoming a national reckoning, she told Nahlee as they watched children, placing traditional items into the cornerstone. But more than that, he proved that truth doesn't die just because the people who know it are silenced. Sometimes it just waits for the right moment, the right person, to bring it into the light. Dr. Thornton had published a comprehensive book about the Southwest land theft conspiracy, with all proceeds going to the Apache Education Fund that had been established with Uncle Ramon's recovered bonds. At 83, he'd found his life's work validated in ways he'd never imagined possible, and he spent his remaining years traveling to reservations across the country, sharing research techniques and encouraging other communities to investigate their own histories of dispossession. Maria Santos had become something of a celebrity as the woman who had helped preserve Uncle Ramon's legacy through decades of isolation and suspicion. Her general store had become an unofficial museum of the case, with displays showing how ordinary people could document injustice and preserve evidence even when official channels were closed to them. The Adobe house itself had been restored and designated as a National Historic Landmark, with scouts serving as the official guardian of Uncle Ramon's legacy. Tour groups visited regularly to learn about the man who had spent 30 years secretly fighting for justice, and the dog who had waited patiently for someone worthy of his trust. But the most meaningful change was visible in the Apache community itself. The recovered lands had been developed carefully, with traditional ecological knowledge guiding modern sustainable practices. Solar farms powered reservation schools, while traditional agriculture provided both economic opportunities and cultural continuity. Young people who had left for the cities were returning to participate in a renaissance that balanced ancient wisdom with contemporary opportunities. As the ceremony concluded with prayers in both Apache and English, Nahlee found herself thinking about the night she'd first arrived at Uncle Ramon's house, feeling forgotten by the world and burdened by losses she couldn't bear alone. The woman who had held that rusty key in her shaking hands seemed like a stranger, now someone who had lived her entire life without understanding the strength that ran in her bloodline like an underground river, always present but hidden from view. The turquoise medallion rested warm against her chest, no longer a relic of the past, but a living connection to a future that stretched ahead of her with possibility and purpose. At 71, she had become the community elder she'd never expected to be, the keeper of stories that had almost been lost forever, and the bridge between generations of Apache people who had never stopped fighting for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible. Scout rose and walked to the edge of the construction site, looking out across land that had been returned to its rightful owners through the courage of one man and the patience of one dog. In the distance, the mountains that had watched over Apache people for thousands of years caught the evening light, and for the first time in generations, they looked down on a people who were not just surviving, but thriving. Uncle Ramon's adobe house stood silhouetted against the sunset, no longer a place of secrets and isolation, but a monument to the truth that could not be buried forever. And in that truth, Nahlee had found not just her inheritance, but her purpose, to ensure that the stories of her people would never be forgotten again, and that the price of justice would never again fall on one person carrying their burden alone in the desert silence. The land remembered everything. Now finally, so did the people who belonged to it.